In 1933, the Senate passed a bill that would have made the standard work week not 40 hours, but 30 hours. It was introduced by Senator Hugo Black and had the support of President Roosevelt. 5-day weeks, 6 hours a day. See, the 40-hour work week was never the goal. That's just kind of where we stopped. After 100 years of labor agitation for better working conditions, and shorter hours, and more leisure, 32 hours seemed to be on the horizon. By the 30s, some people thought that a 6-hour workday was so overdue that by that point, people actually should have been agitating for a 4-hour workday. But now that technology is evolving faster than it ever has and all sorts of work disappearing to AI, there is a renewed conversation around a very old concept, which is that machines are draining work hours from the economy, so the work needs to be shared. This is why John Maynard Keynes predicted a 3-hour workday by 2030. Now that was obviously a swing and a miss for old Keynes, but theoretically, he was right. That should have happened. Productivity has more than doubled since 1950, which means theoretically, we could have easily cut the workday in half, but we haven't. It's 2025, and I don't know anyone leaving work at 1 every day. Instead, and more representative of how people think today, in response to the Democratic Socialists of America calling for a 4-day, 32-hour work week with no reduction in wages or benefits, mayoral candidate and disgraced former Governor Andrew Cuomo said that it was completely unhinged and would destroy our economy. But one of the state senators who endorsed him actually introduced a 32-hour work week bill in New York earlier this year. So interest is growing, and it's being tested out in more and more places. And again, the Senate passed the 30-hour bill like 100 years ago. So the question I want to answer is, how did this idea that once seemed inevitable come to be so radical? And what's the future of it? I'm Spencer Snyder, and this is the 32-hour work week. For a lot of the 1800s and early 1900s, one of the central goals of workers was to shorten the work week.
To live our lives and improve our lives, and more time to enjoy our lives. Those were the two salient definitions of progress in the 19th and well into the 20th century.
In 1835, the first general strike in the U.S. was staged by coal workers in Philadelphia. Their slogan was 6 to 6. 10 hours work and 2 hours for meals. Imagine working to get your day down to 12 hours. Over in Lowell, Massachusetts, women and girls worked in textile mills for 14 hours a day in terrible conditions. They spent years with their union striking, pressuring the mills, and petitioning the state before the mills finally agreed to reduce the workday just to 11 hours in 1853. Wins like that led to the 10-hour day becoming more common. The demand for an 8-hour day was the new battle cry. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what you will. 1867, a citywide strike demanding 8-hour days shut down Chicago for a week. Chicago was in the throes of a civil revolution. United Mine Workers got the 8-hour day in 1898, the Building Trades Council of San Francisco in 1900, but even with an 8-hour day, it didn't mean a 40-hour week.
Used to be, by the way, that everyone worked 44 or 48 hours a week. You'd have half day on Saturday, 5.5 days. If you look at old pictures of baseball games, and you'll see lots of people with wearing white shirts and ties on Saturday afternoon because they got off work in the morning and then they went to the baseball game.
Now, into the 20th century, as unions, communists, and socialists rack up wins for labor, 8 hours becomes more typical. Organizations like the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, start demanding a 5-day week. And the next step, naturally, is restricting the work week to 32 hours.
And so it's in that early 30s period that you do get a lot of experiments with shorter work week. Again, in the rubber industry, 6-hour day. At Kellogg's, a 6-hour day. 30 hours a week.
No one predicted this process would stop. No one. I've done this 50 years, and I have never found anyone who said the process would stop somehow arbitrarily at 8 hours or any other hours.
For 100 years, labor was on a roll. You went from people in the early 1800s working 16 hours a day to people in the 1900s experimenting with 6 hours a day. But now we're coming up on a period where things are going to change. During the Depression, Senator Hugo Black of Alabama introduces this bill that would reduce the work week to 30 hours. Now, Hugo Black was not some crazy socialist. After being a senator FDR appointed him to the Supreme Court, and only after his confirmation did people learn what an active Klan member he had been in the 20s, which is why he had to immediately resign from the Supreme Court. I'm just kidding. He served until the 70s. But his 30-hour workweek bill was good. This was a way to deal with unemployment by sharing the work, but it was also meant to continue this century-long process of shortening the work week. Black said on the floor of the Senate that he hopes the bill would establish throughout this country a normal working day of 6 hours. If we can produce what we need in that time, why work anymore? Roosevelt's Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, supports the bill. Early reporting even called it the Black Perkins Bill. But more importantly, Roosevelt initially supports a 30-hour bill. All the press said the bill is going to pass. Both houses were supposed to pass it, and it did pass in the Senate, 53-30. But between March and April of 1933, Roosevelt withdrew his support. According to Hunnicutt, he began negotiating with business leaders behind closed doors. If they would shorten the work week to 30 hours voluntarily, then he would go easy on antitrust reforms. Additionally, there were a couple other serious concerns of theirs. Frances Perkins wrote that there was no minimum wage clause, and the Supreme Court would surely have found the Black Bill unconstitutional.
But he stopped the bill's progress. Labor raised holy hell. William Greene threatened several times to call a national strike,
which at the time was a very serious threat because people associated national strikes with the national strikes that led to the Russian Revolution. So the 30-hour bill falls through, and instead, in 1933, they create the NRA.
The NRA, National Recovery Administration, will create codes of industrial conduct for 800 different industries, everything from Hollywood to steel and coal. And that's what they did. And those codes often did mandate a shorter work week.
My interpretation of the first New Deal was that Roosevelt was putting in anything he could to pacify labor. The Wagner Bill, moving forward on Social Security, all of those, public works.
The irony is that, just like they feared with the Black 30-hour bill, the NRA was ruled unconstitutional and dissolved after 2 years.
Since the New Deal, which is now 80 years ago, the shorter work week has sort of stalled as an issue.
During the 19th century and through the Depression, the sustaining vision was one of expanding leisure. And we replaced that vision with the hustle.
And this new idea of progress solely focused on more money, more wealth, more work, more stuff, ad infinitum.
More machines, more jobs. Millions of new jobs.
And this shift really kicks off in this era with Roosevelt having to nail something down to please labor.
The people around him come up with a coherent, Keynesian-like plan. That is, the federal government assumes the responsibility to create more work, to replace that taken by the machine from now on.
This is what has to happen to keep work hours from spilling out of the economy like they had been for 100 years. Unions pretty much went along with this, and calls for reduced hours were just never the same.
In the early post-war period, the American left, which included the communists, but also some of the socialists, in the big manufacturing unionized sectors, there were demands for a 30-hour week at 40 hours pay. And there was a big fight at Ford in the early 1950s. It got mixed up in the communist issue because it was the communists who were pushing the shorter work week. But officially, the UAW, for example, which was a very important union in the 50s and 60s, for a while did have a demand for 30 and 30, which was like retirement after 30 years. And 30 hours of work per week, but what the UAW did and other unions and then the companies went along with this to a degree was, instead of reducing the actual work week to 35 or 32 hours of work, they said, we'll just give you extra holidays.
This is automation, today's way of manufacturing.
Now let's get to this idea about technological advancement shortening the work week like Keynes predicted.
This is a prediction people keep making. I'm pretty sure Bill Gates made it, just a few years ago about AI.
Men and women who lived by machines and bought machine-made goods and slept and were wakened to go to the machines.
What incentive would they possibly have to let the working class capture those gains in increased leisure time for exactly the same pay, rather than them capturing it with increased profits? They wouldn't.
So the classic example of this is the cotton gin. Separating cotton fibers from the seeds was terrible, laborious work. It was being done by slaves. When the cotton gin came on the scene and could do this work super fast, they took on more slaves to crank out even more cotton.
One of the things that Karl Marx points out in the chapter on automation in Capital is that the initial effect of introducing factory machinery that greatly increased productivity in the 19th century wasn't to decrease the work week, but actually to increase it, because you could keep people at their stations for much longer without them being too physically exhausted to work.
Automation increases efficiency. The emphasis shifts from manual to mental skills.
So when people make predictions about technology increasing productivity and freeing people of work, the math works out. But that's not the nature of the relationship between labor and companies trying to maximize profits.
It's fairly clear that there's no automatic relationship between the two, that private enterprise will never just do this on its own. The work week has never been shortened, except for when their hand has been forced by the labor movement, the regulatory state, or some combination of the two.
Another thing that doesn't gel with maximizing profits, reducing emissions. Reducing our work week to 32 hours also has environmental benefits, because the more we work, the greater our carbon emissions. More commuting, more convenience goods. When you don't have time to pack lunch, you're more likely to grab a thing that's encased in plastic, which probably also cost you $13. We saw this during the pandemic, that when people were staying home, emissions dropped dramatically. A global 10% reduction in work could cut carbon emissions by over 4%, which might not sound like a lot, but it's roughly equal to the 2021 emissions of the entire country of Pakistan. So it's not nothing. It's also a rare example of something material working people will gain today by taking measures to protect the planet. Because unlike most things we do for the environment that are restrictive in some way, with the 32-hour work week, you are only gaining something. So with all that, where are we with this? Well, the pandemic was a massive shock to the system, and of course, the explosion of AI, this has inspired a lot of lawmakers. In 2021, Representative Mark Takano of California introduced the 32-Hour Workweek Act, and at the state level in California, there was a 32-hour bill. Washington, Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, New York, and Pennsylvania have all had variations of 32-hour proposals since then, ranging from pilot programs to tax credit incentives. In San Juan County, Washington, public employees now work 32 hours a week at full pay. So it would seem that this idea is gaining traction. It's only taken 100 years. But there's a long way to go in making this seem like an inevitability again. I mean, listen to the Wall Street Journal talk about this.
This is absolutely nuts, by the way. In fact, I heard one conservative critic say it's a little bit like a high school kid running for elementary school president and promising to get rid of homework and make every day Ice Cream Friday.
And of course, Cuomo and countless others. Now, does this mean these people are all less progressive than an early 20th century Alabama Klan member? I can see why you'd say that. But it's a good reminder that this won't happen on its own, because advancements in labor never do. So I would just say, in my opinion anyway, moving to a shorter work week would mean more time with your family and loved ones, more time on leisure, more time to rest and recuperate from the job you probably don't like going to, and less time doing frankly bullshit work created by employers and the capitalist class. And I'd also say, we're about 100 years overdue. So hopefully you found this video interesting. My name is Spencer Snyder. You can go follow me on TikTok or Instagram, where I post more short form videos. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next one.